introduction. So first of all, my name is Michael. Nice to meet all of you. I've been a member of this association since the very beginning. Basically, we were created in the summer of 2015 by a friend of mine who was originally a guide in Zurich. And then he decided to repeat the same concept in Geneva as well. When we started off, it was just two people. It was Alex and I. And then we had others joining us throughout the years. We're about 15 guides in total today. Now, the main idea is that we're all volunteers. We don't work for anybody. There is no central organism or anything like this. We do it during our free time, and the majority of the guides are students. I'm not a student. I'm quite passionate about the history of Geneva. I've been studying it for quite a while, and I've been working a lot with various local antiques throughout my life, so I enjoy showing the city to the people coming here. Now, guys, as you obviously figured out, the tours are absolutely free of charge. But if you feel like you particularly enjoyed the tour, we welcome tips in then, but that's entirely up to you. Now we can actually start with the historical part. So right now you're standing on an island, in fact right in the middle of it. This island is in a long oval shape. It stretches behind the stone bridge over there until a little metal bridge over here on the opposite side. And it is on this island that we have the first written historical mention of Geneva, dating to the year 58 before Jesus Christ. Now, original human settlements in Geneva are even older than this. Everything started off with Neolithic settlements some 12,000 years ago. And later on, we had the Elleborgs that were implanted in the region. The Elleborgs were the Gallic people inhabiting this area. And the majority of the Elleborg villages were located in the vicinity of the modern-day lakeside over there. In fact, the majority of these settlements were largely flooded by the lake from 3rd to 2nd century BC because the lake went significantly up in levels. And by the time the Romans came into the city in the 2nd century BC, they decided to create their little town just on top of this hill above our heads over here. And where we're standing now, there was a wooden bridge. And this wooden bridge was a connection point, not just between the two sides of the Rhone River, which we have in front of us, but rather between two sides of the world. On this side it was the Roman world, while on this side it was the Celtic world. What happened here in the year 58 BC is that there was a massive migration of the Helvetian tribes, the native people inhabiting Switzerland, who were trying to cross onto the Roman side, escaping the Germanic tribes that were pushing them away. The Romans were not too keen about letting the Helvetians pass, for one simple reason is that they wanted to have a security cushion between themselves and the Germanics. And rather than letting them through, Julius Caesar, who was the commander of the Roman troops in this region, ordered this wooden bridge to be burned down and prevent the Helvetians from crossing by any means. This was done, and because of this, the Helvetians were forced to continue the migration to the city of Lugdunum, which became modern-day Lyon, and is located about 150 kilometers down this way, down the flow of the Rhone. Later on, the Romans started their expansion, first occupying parts of modern-day France and later spreading on towards modern-day England. This is where the majority of the Roman expansion has started. All the way through the late Roman Empire and the early Middle Ages, there were several minor fortifications on this island, but nothing particularly massive until in the 13th century, the local bishop has decided to construct a castle here in order to protect the city from the Savoyan invasions. This castle was quite large, and it occupied the majority of the center portion of this island. And it stood here for several hundreds of years, until the Great Fire of 1670 has destroyed this castle almost entirely, and by 1677 they dismantled the majority of the rubble that was here, thus exposing a part of the square that we're presently on right now. When I'm saying the majority of this castle has perished, is because one of the defensive towers has actually survived the fire, and this is the tower that you have right in front of you today. It is a part of this original castle that was not as badly damaged as other structures adjacent to it, so was largely preserved. It was standing here without any major changes until the late 19th century, when the city again started talks about the tower's demolition in order to expand the square even further. However, in the last moment, it was saved by a popular vote, and rather than demolishing the tower, the city hired the famous local architect, Mr Edmond Fassiot, who surveyed this building by 3.5 meters in order for it to dominate adjacent structures. They remodeled it to save, and also replaced the clocks of the tower with this unique clock just by about 1900. The last addition that was done to this building is the statue right in front of it, dating from the year 1909. It is a statue of a famous local resistance hero and a martyr, Mr Philibert Berthillier. What you have to know about the history of Geneva is that for a very long time, Geneva was an independent state, being governed by a lineage of local bishops who became subjects of the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1032, later on obtaining the status of a prince and thus becoming prince bishops. After around the year 1000, the city was also under the indirect governance of the counts of Geneva, whose main residency was in the city of Annecy, and the political division between the bishop and the count was quite unclear until the Treaty of Seyssel of 1124 that clearly gave the religious governance of the city to the bishop and the governance of the adjacent territories to the count. This is extremely important because the lineage of the counts has died out in the late 1300s, and the city went under the indirect influence of the Savoy family, which was the great power dominating the region back in those days. And this indirect domination by the Savoyans that followed was not at all a unanimous concept. Many of the locals were strongly against it, most notably Mr Philibert Berthillier. He was a leader of the Huguenots, the people who wanted to have an alliance with the already existing Swiss Confederation, such cities as Bern and Fribourg. For his political views, he was first imprisoned in this tower early in the year 1519, and later on in that year, he was condemned to death and beheaded on the orders of the local prince bishop, exactly where we're standing right now. This is the reason why his statue is attached to chains, and he's pointing to a Latin sign that says that I die, but I will live on and spread the word of God. His death did not go in vain, and only 7 years after it, in the year 1526, Geneva was forced to sign the first act of mutual alliance with the cities of Bern and Fribourg. Nowadays we know it as the Act of Combourgeoisie, and this is what opened the gates of the city to the Reformation, which came another 10 years later. But we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail in about half an hour from now. Now guys, this was just a small historical introduction. The majority of the tour will cover the past 500 years or so, although we'll be more concentrating on the Reformation and the centuries that followed. And please don't hesitate to ask any questions if you have any throughout the tour. But at the same time, keep in mind that we're in a very tight schedule. We have lots to see and lots to fit in, so the whole tour is going to be in a relatively rapid pace. And we're going to move just slightly further over here so I can show you some adjacent landmarks. Now, first of all, we have this building right over here. It originally started off in the early 1830s as a one-story open market of the city. It was a venture that quickly became bankrupt after about 10 years of operation. And from 1841 to 1842, they elevated it with these additional floors of slightly different color. Once they did this, this became the local post office. It remained the post office for about a decade, and then they added a police station to this building. Until in the year 1876, it was purchased by the Crédit Lyonnais Bank, and it remained the Crédit Lyonnais until very recently, only about 10 years ago. Then it was purchased by the Indo-Suez, and today it's presently the Indo-Suez private banking building. This building right in the middle of the island is the old local slaughterhouse. This is where they killed the animals in the city. It was a location that was constructed in the mid to late 1840s, and it was supposed to unify the majority of all slaughterhouses in the city into one centralized location built according to more modern sanitary standards. However, what they did not anticipate is that this building quickly found itself right in the middle of a very rapidly developing city, and there were many complaints about all the noises and the bad smells that were coming from it. So they closed it down after about 20 years of operation. They demolished the facade of the building and they converted it into a market. It remained a market until the late 1970s, when it also went bankrupt because of all the supermarkets opening throughout the city. And just like the tower, it was condemned to demolition. But in the last moment, it was saved by an art association, and they opened a bar and an art center inside this building. And this is what it is today, although everyone still remembers it as the Halles de l'Île, or the markets of the island. It remains its popular name. We have a building with a long black roof over there, just before the modern building and after the stone bridge. You can see a huge black roof just behind the tram that's passing. And this is the Bâtiment de Force Motrice, or the old hydroelectric power station of the city that was constructed between 1882 to 1886. The reason why I'm mentioning it to you is that it's directly related to the history of the jet d'eau, or the Geneva fountain that can be found over there nowadays. The original fountain used to be located right next to this building over there. And the story of its creation is quite interesting because back in the late 19th century, it this was the industrial area of the city. There was this hydroelectric power plant. Across the river from it, there was a gold refining factory, and there were multitudes of very small factories and workshops operating in the region. By the middle of the 1880s, the majority of these businesses were installing hydroelectric machinery in order to augment their production power. And these hydroelectric machines were being powered directly by the bâtiment de force motrice. At the end of every working day, these machines were being flushed down into the city water supply system, which was causing huge surges of pressure. It led to several pipes bursting, and it was a persisting problem, until in the year 1886, one cantonal engineer had the brilliant idea to install a security valve that would let out all the excessive pressure at once. And this created the first stream of water that was about 30 meters high, that quickly became very popular amongst the locals and the tourists coming to the city. When only after several years, there was no longer need for such an engineerical structure, there was actually a popular demand about recreating the jet d'eau in another spot with a purely decorational purpose this time. And thus they created the second fountain, which was located right next to the island over there. It was not a very practical location for it. During strong winds, it was covering the pavement with water, so they quickly got rid of it. And in the year 1891, for the 600th anniversary of Switzerland, they inaugurated the present-day fountain in its actual location. Since then, it has been augmented in size several times, especially during the 1950s when they installed the new machinery chamber underneath the structure. And today it reaches a medium height of about 145 meters, and the water comes out at 500 liters per second. Nowadays, it's a purely decorational fountain. There is no engineerical purpose behind it like it used to have in the past. And now we're going to go down towards the central streets over there, so we're going to go here. So we just arrived to the Gridlock Artery. This name originates from an old French word for people who worked with horses. And the reason for this name is that already back in the 17th century, there was a large manege, basically a horse center, that was standing right over here. It performed various kinds of horse shows, races, occasionally sold horses as well. And even after the point in time when it was demolished, already in the 18th century, this continued to be the horse region of the city. And there were many commerces throughout this area that were somehow associated with horses. In fact, the last producer of horseshoes that was manufacturing them only closed down in the year 1925, and it was located right in the middle of the street over there on the left side. The reason why the street runs in a straight line like this today, and why all the buildings on this side look pretty much identical to each other, is that this was an artery that was extended between the city fortifications located on this side and the city moat located on the opposite side, from 1825 to 1834. This was done on the orders of General Guillaume-Henri Dufour, who was employed as a cantonal engineer back in those days, and all the buildings were designed by one architect, Mr Samuel Vaucher, and this is why they look identical to each other. If you look very carefully across the street, you will see the flag of Geneva, which is a key and an eagle. As I mentioned, Geneva became a member of the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1032, and the heraldics of the Holy Roman Empire are the double-headed eagle. The local prince-bishops that were governing the city in the early 1400s, their heraldics were the two keys, called the Keys of St. Peter, very similar in appearance to those of the Vatican nowadays. And what they did around 1405, 1410 was very simple. They cut the two heraldics in half and they combined them into one. So it's half of the double-headed eagle and one of the two keys. Bizarrely, the symbolism was not changed even after the days of the Reformation, although it can be interpreted as some presence of the old regime inside it. And now we're going to go slightly further over there. Just a small tip, there's a face over here on the wall. For now, I just want to tell you her name. Her name is Catherine Royum, and she's extremely important for the rest of the tour, so just keep her in mind, and you'll find out why she's so famous in about 25 minutes from now. Now guys, we're standing in front of the statue of Mr. Henri Dunant. You might recognize him as the founder of the Red Cross. Mr. Dunant started off his career as a Geneva banker who was very fond of humanitarian values, and he really managed to change this world in the year 1859 when he went to seek appointment with the French Emperor Napoleon III during the Battle of Solferino, which was a battle of the united French and Savoyan troops against the Austrians. Prior to this battle, there were no internationally recognized conventions that specified the treatment of wounded soldiers, soldiers who decided to surrender, who were imprisoned, as well as the treatment of misplaced civilian population. Mr. Dunant was so concerned about all the atrocities and the lack of organization that he has witnessed on the battlefield that he decided to summarize all the problems and his vision to their solutions in a manifesto that he called the Memoirs of Solferino. It took about 3 years for him to write it, from 1859 to 1862, after which he published several thousand copies of this manifesto in Geneva, and he started seeking funds throughout the world for a new foundation that he has imagined. He was extremely successful in this venture, and in less than 2 years, by late 1863, he managed to collect enough money from most major political players and world powers of that day, and using this cash, he opened the organization that we know as the Red Cross today. The reason for this name is that Mr. Dunant and his colleagues decided to choose the inverted Swiss flag as the original logo. He was an extremely popular man throughout the rest of his life. He received many awards and prizes, including the first Nobel Peace Prize ever awarded. He was also one of the main authors of the first Geneva Conventions that took place during the same year as the Red Cross Foundation in 1864. And as I mentioned, he was very popular throughout the world, but not so much in his natal city of Geneva. He had some enemies locally, and the reason for this was that he was originally a banker, and he was not a very successful one. He managed to lose large sums of money for some of his clients in the city, and because of this he actually finished his life in the Swiss-German part in the year 1910. The reason why his statue is here has to do with another aspect of his humanitarian activities, which was his constant loot against the death penalty, which was finally abolished in the year 1871, largely due to his efforts. This over here was the place of executions in Geneva. This is where the guillotine stood, starting from the year 1799, and up to the early 1860s, there were 35 people decapitated on this precise spot. And this is why they marked it with the statue of the greatest humanist of Geneva. I don't know if you noticed or not, but you're also standing right in front of the largest surviving chunk of the city fortifications, dating to the year 1719. Geneva, being the Protestant Rome right in the middle of Catholic Europe, had quite a few enemies. Countries like Savoy and France that constantly wanted to annex the city, and because of this, Geneva possessed one of the most extensive systems of fortifications in Europe. They were so massive that they were running 360 degrees around the whole town, even on water, in the form of wooden pillars that were attached to each other with chains. And here where we are now, this square is called the Place de Neuve. the fortifications were its most massive state of development. They were running in several layers. Here was only the first layer, while the other layers were about where those buildings are over there. And in between the layers, there was a massive artificial waterfront incoming from the Rhone River and ending its journey inside the park over here. This whole massive defensive structure was dominated by a gate that was standing right in the middle of the square, and this gate was very much like a medieval castle. It had a bridge that went up during nighttime and protected the city from illegal entrance. This gate was called the Porte de Neuve, and this is what gave the name to the square which we're on right now, which is the Place de Neuve. The majority of these fortifications were demolished between the years 1850 to 1860, following the arrival into power of a new very progressive government in the city after the revolution of 1846 under the leadership of James Fazy. Mr. Fazy was a very progressive politician that decided to transform Geneva on all various aspects of lifestyle. He decided to conduct a religious reform, once again allowing Catholics, Jews, Masons and Orthodoxes to return to the city, from which they were banished from for many hundreds of years following the Reformation. He decided to perform a political reform, allowing new parties into the parliament and transforming the constitution. And he also decided to undertake an architectural reform, demolishing many of the old fortifications that restrained the city's development and replacing them by broad new streets and squares. And this is why we have such a strong contrast between the old town just above our heads over here and the new city, which literally starts just in front of you over here. And now we're going to go right in the middle of the square to the statue on horseback. Now, we're standing in front of the statue of General Henri Dufour, who is one of the most notable personalities in modern Swiss history. The general started off his career as a young officer in the army of Napoleon Bonaparte during the days of the French invasion. And I just wanted to underline this chapter in a little more detail because Geneva had its revolution break out in the year 1792. In the year 1798, Geneva and its adjacent regions were officially annexed by France. Napoleon has declared it to become a part of the French Republic called the Département de Léman. Later on, it became a part of the French Empire. However, on the 30th of December, 1813, the French withdrew their troops from the city, from the Porte de Neuve that was standing literally over here, under the pressure of the Austrian troops that were entering the city from the opposite side. In 1814, Geneva proclaimed its independence. In the year 1815, the city officially joined Switzerland. And finally, in the year 1816, after a long series of territorial disputes and after the Treaty of Turin, the canton of Geneva obtained its modern-day territories. After all of this has happened, the general became the cantonal engineer in charge of the development of the city water supply system, the city parks, and some of the city streets. He was notably the author of the outline of the modern-day Conservatory, the street which we just walked along a few minutes ago. Later on, he became a great cartographer, and he managed to design the first topographically correct map of Switzerland, which is still in use today and is known as the Dufour map. In the year 1838, he also became the founder of the Swiss Topographical Bureau that still exists nowadays. However, the greatest merit came to the general throughout his military career. In the year 1847, there was a civil war that broke out in the country, known as the Sonderbund War. Several of the Catholic cantons, most of which was Swiss German, like Uri, Schwyz, Unterwald, Luzern, Fribourg, and Valais, decided to succeed from the Confederation in order to form an alliance of their own called the Sonderbund. This was interpreted as an act of high treason by the federal government, who immediately appointed the commander-in-chief of the United Swiss Armed Forces, who was supposed to crush this rebellion and restore the unity of the country. The general was almost unanimously elected by the parliament as the commander-in-chief, although himself he was not too keen about that idea, being a notable pacifist. But nonetheless, he accepted this post, and he was extremely successful in this venture. He managed to crush the Sonderbund only in several weeks, with less than 100 casualties. Because of this, he became a Swiss national hero and a very popular politician. And using a lot of his political influence, he was one of the people who pushed for signing of a new Swiss constitution the following year, which is the Constitution of 1848, and is the actual constitution that we still use nowadays. Because of this, the general can be regarded in many ways as one of the founding fathers of the modern country. Towards the end of his life, he actually became the co-founder of the Red Cross. Mr. Dunant over there was only the Secretary General, while General Dufour was the first president of the organization. But like it happens in many organizations, the Secretary General obtained a lot more political power in his hands, and this was not particularly pleasing to the general. The two had a conflict, and the general took a quiet retirement after this point in time. Now, to point out some other landmarks that surround us, we have the oldest building by far in the square, which is this one. This is the Roth Museum, constructed between the years 1824 to 1826 by Mr. Samuel Vaucher, especially for Mr. Simon Roth, who was the richest Geneva industrialist in the beginning of the 19th century. Mr. Roth decided to invest a significant part of his personal fortune and his personal art collections into opening the first private museum in the city. And this has been a functioning museum almost for the past 200 years now. This building over here is the Grand Théâtre. The name might be misleading because it is actually the city's opera house, constructed between the years 1876 to 1879 on a project that was supposed to become a smaller copy of the Opéra Garnier in Paris. And this is why the outlines of the facade might seem familiar to you. It's a building that has an extremely unlucky history. It burned down badly during the 1950s, with only the majority of the facade surviving. And in 2016, it was attacked by a massive anarchist demonstration. They started throwing particularly destructive paint on top of the limestone statues and the walls, causing a multi-million damage to the building. It has been under renovation for 2.5 years, and they just opened it up about 4 months ago. This building over here is the city's conservatory, originally constructed in the year 1835, just in the park behind us over here. This building is slightly newer and dates to the year 1856. What is curious about it is that it was constructed right on top of the city fortifications that were leveled down a few years prior to this. And in fact, even today, there are still some traces of soil elevations that are not of natural origin on both sides of the building. Just before we go inside the park over here, I wanted to show you this street going in parallel to the park like this. This street is called the Rue de Carouge, and it leads to a second city in the canton of Geneva that is known as Carouge. Carouge today is kind of a regular suburb of Geneva, but it wasn't always the case. Back in the past, it was not Geneva, and it was not even Switzerland. It was a part of another country known as Sardinia-Piedmont, or Savoia. It's a country that became modern-day Italy in the year 1861 after the Italian reunification under Vittorio Emanuele II. Carouge was originally created as a little trade village adjacent to Geneva. In the year 1786, it obtained the status of a town, and it remained a part of Sardinia-Piedmont until the days of the Napoleonic invasion. The French have put an end to all of this. They annexed Carouge together with Geneva under the Département de Léman, and once Geneva regained its independence, Carouge was briefly ceded back to the Italian party for about a half-year period. But then, after the Treaty of Turin of 1816, in exchange for some other adjacent territories, it became a part of the modern-day canton. So it has already been 203 years since Carouge has joined the city, but if you go there today, you will still see an immense contrast in architecture between the main city and Carouge. All the buildings look quite Italian in style, like in the Piedmont region around Turin. They're only 2-3 stories high, and it has its nice own little city center within the city. In fact, many of the old Italian street names are still preserved. For example, one of the central squares of Carouge is still called the Sardinia Square. And if you want to go there for a little walk, it's very easy. You can either walk there down this way, it's about a 25-minute walk, or you can take the tram number 12 for about 6 stops And it's a very nice place to have dinner in the evening. For example, we'll see something different in the city. And now we're going to go right inside the park.